Aitäh, Aleksandra, tere hommikust ja aitäh ka Kadrioru kunstimuuseumile selle kutse eest siia rääkima tulla, hästi suur rõõm siin olla. Ja nagu Aleksandra ütles, ettekanne on inglise keeles, aga kui keegi tahab midagi eesti keeles küsida, selline võimalus on ka. Ja Pauli juba peaks keelt vahetama. As Pauli mentioned, our collection, the collection of the foundation and museum is about 10,000 pieces, and the collection was established by Gösta Serlachiuse, who we see here, in a portrait by the Swedish artist Bror Börjesson. And today I will talk about Gösta's role in the Finnish art scene between 1919 and 1942. The reason I've limited this time period is because it's a bit difficult to pinpoint exactly when Gösta's collecting became serious. I think it was in 1912 that he first mentioned his idea of a future gallery in a letter to the Finnish artist Akseli Gallen-Kallela. And then during the First World War, his collecting became more serious, and in 1919 it was first on public display. And almost all of the artworks that you will see during the presentation will be in the exhibition here, the Symphony of Art and Nature, so you can see them here with one exception. Gösta was the nephew of Gustav Adolf Serlachius, who you see here, who founded a paper mill in the middle of the woods, basically, in 1868. And already Gustav Adolf Serlachius supported financially two emerging young Finnish artists, Aksel Gallen, who later changed his name to Akseli Gallen-Kallela, and the sculptor Emil Wikström. When G.A. Serlachius started supporting these young artists, he encouraged them to depict national subjects and declared that they should only think about elevating Finnish art. In fact, it has even been seen that G.A. Serlachius had a central role in the breakthrough of Finnish national romanticism, because he encouraged Gallen to pursue national subjects and paid him a monthly allowance. Then Gösta Serlachius not only continued his uncle's work as the CEO of the family business, but also as a patron of the arts. Furthermore, he was an avid art lover and collector of fine arts, who in 1933 established a foundation bearing his name, but we'll get to that later. Gösta Serlachius seemed to have been aesthetically inclined from an early age and started purchasing beautiful items, including antique furniture and a pastel portrait of a young lady. But it wasn't until the 1910s, however, that Serlachius started purchasing art more actively, mainly thanks to his growing wealth. Gösta had befriended the artist Akseli Gallen-Kallela, and many of the acquisitions focused on his works. For example, two of the paintings that can be seen here in this exhibition, Stubblefield and Manta Rapids, were both painted in Manta and its vicinity in 1917 and became part of Gösta Serlachius' collection. Here you see the Manta Rapids. Artist friends and advisors were essential for Gösta's collecting. With expert help, he was able to purchase high-quality works to build a prominent collection. His networks of art professionals included, in addition to artists, art historians, museum curators, and art dealers, many of whom he befriended during many years of cooperation. And here, for example, in the painting Stubblefield, you can see Gösta Serlachius lying here in the foreground. That's the artist Pekka Halonen, smoking a cigarette with a red butterfly on his pants, and the artist and curator Erik O.W. Erström digging a hole for the roast, because they've been on a hunting trip together in the vicinity of Manta. Early on, Serlachius envisaged his collection being publicly displayed in a museum, which in turn increased his purchases. One can only speculate how much the prospect of a museum affected his decisions when choosing works of art. So in 1919, his collection was on public display for the first time in Atheneum Art Museum in Helsinki. The exhibition consisted of 86 works, including 24 by Akseli Gallen-Kallela. So already at this point you see how central role the art of Akseli Gallen-Kallela played in his collection. This work, The Theft of Sampo, which is a sketch for a larger painting, is not only here in this exhibition, but it was also part of the first display in 1919 in Atheneum. One of the leading art critics at the time, Onni Okkonen, wrote a positive review of the exhibition, highlighting especially the early works of Akseli Gallen-Kallela and how Serlachius' collection enriches the image that public has of the artist's early production. The organizer of the exhibition was Erik O.W. Edström, who you saw in the previous image. Well, only he's behind. Edström was an artist and a polymath, working as a curator in the Atheneum Art Museum at the time. As mentioned, Gösta Serlachius often relied on the advice of experts. Among his collaborators were chief curator of the Helsinki Kunsthalle Bertel Hintze and art dealer Louis Richter, for example. Using expert help was a way for Gösta Serlachius to make sure his collection would feature prominent works by painters significant for the art market. He wanted to become an important person in the Finnish art scene, and his actions had made an impression among the notable gallerists in Helsinki even before the exhibition in Atheneum of his budding collection. Expanding his networks among gallerists and other art experts meant that he would have a good chance of purchasing important works before others. Serlachius also established personal relations with many artists and bought works directly from them. In the beginning of the 1920s, however, Gösta Serlachius had to cut down on purchasing new works of art due to recession. However, in the mid-1920s, the price of paper went up again, and Serlachius was able to resume his interest in art. In addition to purchasing works for his own collection, Gösta Serlachius also donated funds to build the Helsinki Kunsthalle. During and after the First World War, Helsinki was missing a public exhibition space for art. The salons and galleries of commercial art dealers defined what kind of art the public was allowed to see. In fact, as art historian Maija Koskinen points out, in the late 1920s, there were only a few art institutions organizing exhibitions in Finland, in addition to the Atheneum Art Museum and a few galleries. As mentioned, Gösta eventually donated money for the construction of the building that was to become the Helsinki Kunsthalle, but the donation got postponed several times due to the recession. The public debate concerning these difficulties affected Serlachius and made him forget Helsinki as the location of his own museum. Gösta Serlachius had made up his mind about building a museum in Mänttö. Like his uncle before him, Gösta Serlachius emphasized national values, but perhaps more from a local perspective. Gösta Serlachius wanted to beautify the town of Mänttö. I quote, "Why should I not let my collection accumulate in the community that has seen it being born? There's no need to amass everything beautiful to the capital. There are people in the countryside too who are interested in art or whose interest it is possible to arouse." End quote. Central to these plans was establishing the Gösta Serlachius Fine Arts Foundation in 1933. As its goals, the foundation said purchasing good works by Gallen-Kallela, including all of his graphic works, works by significant older artists, and first-class contemporary works by Finnish artists. It was also stated that, if possible, the foundation should annually try to purchase important works of foreign art. The brother of Gösta Serlachius' second wife, Ruth, Magnus Björkenheim, noted that compared to other countries or other Nordic countries, Finland has relatively few works by old masters. Therefore, it would be of great cultural significance should the foundation be able to purchase at least some such pieces. Among the important works of old masters purchased in the late 1930s are two masterpieces of Spanish Baroque, Man, Wine Bottle and Tambourine by José de Rivera, which you see here, and Fruit Basket and Cardoon by Juan de Zurbarán. And both paintings were bought in 1938. The Rivera was purchased from an old masters gallery, the Spanish art gallery Thomas Harris Limited in London, with the help of Professor Tancred Borenius. From the correspondence regarding this painting, it becomes clear that Gösta Serlachius always wanted to have the last word when it came to purchases. Quote, "Because I've always had the habit of purchasing only works of art that I like, we should arrange things so that I will receive a photograph of the painting Professor recommends, or at least a telegram with some sort of description of the work." The correspondence does, however, give the impression that Gösta Serlachius did himself see the painting while visiting London. The Fruit Basket and Cardoon, on the other hand, was purchased by Louis Richter as a work by Giovanni Battista Ruoppolo, even though the signature by Juan de Zurbarán was visible. In his letter to Gösta Serlachius, Bertel Hintze emphasizes how the still life can never in the world be by Zurbarán. This misapprehension was repeated by many scholars up until the early 1980s, when the painting was finally attributed to Juan de Zurbarán thanks to a research and exhibition project. Be that as it may, Bertel Hintze already in his letter recognizes the significance of Gösta Serlachius' art acquisitions. Quote, "I don't think that ever before have such great acquisitions of old art been purchased to Finland as you have been able to do in a single year, and I can only congratulate you from the bottom of my heart." End quote. The prospect of the museum comes up in the letter with a reference that even the Atheneum or Sinebrykov Art Museum can't compete with Serlachius' acquisitions except for one or two individual paintings. Hintze declares, I quote, "The Mäntä Museum will one day become an internationally acknowledged museum that foreign experts will have to look up to be able to study old paintings." With several loans of important works to international exhibitions during the past decades, and with the two Serlachius seminars in 22 and 24, not to mention the research and exhibition project Master IS, the enigmatic contemporary of Rembrandt, executed in collaboration with Museum de Lakenhal in Leiden, the Netherlands in 25, the Serlachius Museum has certainly established itself as an institution worthy of the attention of international scholars and experts of old European art. But how does this relate to the nationalistic agenda of the past? From the correspondence, one can read notions of accumulating Finnish collections with works that would give Finnish art institutions more credibility in international comparison. Even though it was important to support Finnish artists and encourage national subjects, it became increasingly important to impress on the international art market too. Some old master paintings in the collection still need more research, and there are questionable attributions. But there were more controversial aspects to these international activities in the 1930s. Art historian Kersti Tainio has delved into the effects of the Russian Revolution in 1917 to the art market of old masters. After the revolution, many cultural treasures were nationalized from royal and princely collections and sold abroad to help finance the 5-year plans of the communist regime between 1928 and 1937. Gösta Serlachius bought 13 paintings from the Soviet Union, 8 of these via his collaborator Bertel Hintze, whom you see here with his pipe. The Finnish people had mixed feelings about this trade in the 1930s. For some, it was immoral to purchase works of art that many felt were looted. On the other hand, there were many who saw rescuing important works as a patriotic project, and that Finland should grab its chance to accumulate the country's modest collection of old masters. Tainio assumes that this patriotic discourse helped Hintze and Serlachius to legitimize their acquisitions and ignore the possibility of negative publicity. In fact, the historian Oula Silvennoinen, author of Gösta Serlachius' biography, sees Serlachius as part of the political elite in Finland in the years between the world wars that identified their own interest as the common interest of the society. A stance like this might blur the ethical boundaries of such purchases. But But in the end, amassing old European art to Finland had educational aspects too. Magnus Björkenheim also thought it would benefit Finnish artists if they had the opportunity to study works by old masters in Finland. Moreover, Bertel Hintze asked for artwork loans from the old masters' collection to be exhibited in Helsinki. Quote, "Great many people who are most interested in art are in a situation that they can never make the trip to Mäntä to visit their upcoming museum." And this hasn't changed that much, as you heard from Pauli, but luckily they can now come to Tallinn. It was important to make art accessible for the public, and wealthy patrons like Gösta Serlachiuse played a key role in this process. The process of establishing a foundation was initiated in December 1933 with the intention of establishing and maintaining a museum in Mäntä. In the founding meeting that took place next year, Gösta Serlachiuse explained why he wanted his foundation and the planned museum to be based in Mäntä, even though he knew the decision might be criticized. He felt that a person who has lived through the birth and development of a society as ideal as Mäntä will learn to love their home region more deeply than others. There were roughly 200 works of art in the collection that Gösta Serlachiuse donated to the newly established foundation in the founding document in December 1933. Even though the majority of the collection was gifted to the foundation, there were still almost 30 works that remained in the possession of Gösta and Serlachiuse. Among these, for example, art connoisseurs in the Louvre by Gunnar Berntram. It goes to show that Gösta couldn't depart with all his beloved artworks, but wanted to keep at least the most important close to hand. The worldwide depression in the early 30s didn't have much effect on Serlachius' art purchases. Quite the contrary, during the decade, prices were relatively low, and Serlachius was able to accumulate his collection, as the earlier examples of the old masters show. The outbreak of the Second World War in 1939, however, meant that purchasing new works of art came to an almost complete halt. But as an interesting curiosity, it might be mentioned that in 1939, Bertel Hintze, commissioned by Serlachius, bought this sculpture from Tallinn by Estonian sculptor Martin Saks, one of the last acquisitions before the war. And this sculpture isn't unfortunately part of this exhibition. It can be seen in Mäntä. During the war, Gösta Serlachiuse had various duties working for the government. He was also worried about his collection and keeping it safe from Soviet bombings. While running government errands in England, Gösta wrote to his wife Ruth and thought about evacuating the collection to Sweden. Quote, "What would it mean for Finland if 70 of the best works by Gallen were destroyed?" End quote. One might argue that there were good works by Akseli Gallen-Kallela in other collections too, but this quote proves that Gösta Serlachiuse knew his collection to be of national significance. Even during the war, Gösta Serlachiuse was making plans for his museum. Several architects were consulted, among them Jarl Eklund and Toivo Anttila. However, Serlachiuse wasn't happy with any of these plans. He had acquired quite advanced knowledge of museum infrastructure, and there was always something in the architect's plans that didn't satisfy Serlachiuse. Eventually, the architect Uno Urberg was hired to plan the museum, but even he didn't get to execute the museum because Gösta Serlachiuse passed away in October 1942, and this meant that the plans to build the museum were put aside. After the death of Gösta Serlachiuse, his son Ralf-Erik Serlachiuse became the chair of the foundation. Gösta had still had valuable artworks in his possession, and transferring these works to the foundation was a high priority. This meant paying taxes and other costs, and therefore the museum project was interrupted for the time being. However, the vice chair of the foundation, Bertel Hintze, still noted that collecting funds for a future museum should be a priority for the foundation. For the representatives of the foundation, many of them notable people in the Finnish art scene, the collection was too important not to be on public display. Even though there was no museum building per se, the museum opened its doors on August 26, 1945, when certain rooms of the Joenniemi Manor were opened to the public. Ruth Serlachiuse, the widow of Gösta, was still living in the manor at that time. The museum expanded in 1962 after Ruth Serlachiuse moved to Helsinki, but the museum was still only open for 2 hours on Sundays. It wasn't until 1973 that the museum hired its first full-time caretaker and started its journey towards a professionally upheld art institution. At the time of Gösta Serlachiuse's passing, the collection of the foundation amounted to over 500 works of art. Over 300 of the pieces were from the 20th century and about 120 from the latter half of the 19th century. These numbers help to illustrate how large a portion of Gösta Serlachiuse's collection consisted of contemporary art. It is also worth bearing in mind that there were relatively few acquisitions of foreign contemporary art, which means that the importance of the collection to the Finnish art scene in the early 20th century was indisputable. You will see self-portraits by a few artists that Gösta supported, and Gösta was also, he preferred portraits of artists. That's why there's many of them in the collection, and that's why we chose many of them to the exhibition here. Gösta Serlachiuse purchased both contemporary art and old masters open-mindedly. He also helped numerous artists by purchasing their works and supporting them financially. By purchasing old masters, Serlachius ensured that there would be prominent works of older art in Finnish collections too, not only making Finnish art institutions interesting from an international perspective, but giving Finnish artists and art lovers the opportunity to study these works without traveling abroad. In the late 1930s, Gösta Serlachiuse appealed to politicians and government officials to help secure funding for the arts. His wish was that fine arts would be available in the countryside too, and not just in the bigger cities. Serlachiuse suggested that every time a new building was constructed, a certain amount of money would be allotted for fine arts to decorate that building with. It took several decades for this principle to become reality, but Gösta Serlachiuse was ahead of his time by suggesting this. As to the foundation bearing its name, Gösta Serlachiuse took far-sighted precaution to make sure it stood on stable ground economically and that its future would be secure. He felt that his collection was important enough to be preserved and displayed for future generations. After the industrialist's death, the Gösta Serlachiuse Fine Arts Foundation has continued the work of its founder. Thank you.
Oleme natuke ajast maas, aga ma arvan, et kui teil on 1-2 lühikest küsimust Tomile. Mina mõtlesin selle, et kas millist rolli võib-olla Serlachiuse majanduslikus elus mängis see, et ta oli kunstikoguja, kas rahvuslikul tasemel olulise kunstikogu omamine aitas teda tema äris või sellises poliitilises mõjutegevuses?
Ma arvan, et isegi ei eriti palju. Muidugi kõik see raha, millega ta ostis kunsti, oleks ka võinud tema tehasesse panna ja nii edasi, aga siiski ma arvan, et olid nii suured, et arvan, et oli pigem tähtis, et tal oli see kunstikogu, mis võib olla, sest see oli rahvuslikult tähtis ja nagu öeldati, siis see Soome rahva nagu eneseteadvuse ja iseseisvuse nendega seotud, nii et see oli tähtis, et tal oli see kunstikogu, mitte ainult see imperium neid tehaseid.
Tal portreel on orden rinnas, et mis aumärk see on?
Neid on mõni, ma arvan, ja aga see, mis see nüüd oli eesti keeles, ma ei mäleta enam, me räägime sellest edakale, siis ma ei oska seda inglise keeles, seda rohkem öelda, siis nii, ja valge roosi, siis valguse ristin ridarikunta soome keeles, aga siin nende hulgas on ka sealt sõdast ja kusagilt neid, et ma ei mäleta kõik neid.
Aga need olid siis Soome Vabariigi autäht, jah, et siis 30-ndatel. On veel?
Ma küsin sellisest, et kas ta tundis Martin Saksa personaalselt oli kellegi vahendaja kaudu, sellepärast, et ta oli väga huvitav isiksus Martin Saks ise ja tema tütrest tuli hiljem ju üks juhtivaid klaasikunstnikke Eestis. Nii et nõnda oli ta väga tore kodu. Või oli keegi vahendaja, kes seda Martin Saksa siis nagu vahendas talle 39. aastal?
Aitäh küsimuse eest, väga huvitav kuulla rohkem sellest. Ma arvan, et Gösta ei tundnud kunstnikud, vaid sest see oli Pärtel Hintse, tema koostöölane, kes sõidis Tallinnasse ja ostis selle teose. Ja ma ei tea, et kas Pärtel Hintse tundi kunstnikud või mitte, aga ei tea, aga arvan, et Gösta ei tundnud Martin Saks.
Aitäh!